Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about changes to the Constitution since 1997 and debates about further reform in A-level politics. So that's not just all the knowledge you need to know with key specific examples, also some key points of analysis that you can use in your essays, and some really important and likely questions you could get asked in your exam so that you can be fully prepared for your exam. So in this video, I'm going to start by going through the parts of the specification this video covers and the potential essay questions and key debates you can get asked about in the exam. From there, I'm going to look at New Labour's constitutional reforms. So looking at House of Lords reform, looking at the Human Rights Act, devolution, electoral reform. From there, I'm going to go on to the Coalition's constitutional reforms and reforms undertaken since 2015. We're finally looking at debates over further reforms, specifically the codification and entrenchment of the Constitution. The PDF you should be seeing up there, you can access in the first link in the description to the Politics Explained website, where you can also find lots of resources to help you in your politics A-level, including essay plans, everything you need to know guides, as well as a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the parts of the specification this video covers. So I've already got a video on the Politics Explained YouTube channel on devolution, including debates about further reform to devolution in England and to existing bodies. And I've already got a video on the first part of the Constitution topic. So this video covers everything else. So it looks at how the Constitution has changed since 1997, so under Labour, under the Coalition, and any major reforms undertaken since. And then it looks at a kind of key part of the debates about further reform topic. So it looks at the extent to which the individual reforms since 1997 should be taken further, and it looks at whether the UK Constitution should be changed to be entrenched and codified, including a Bill of Rights. That part on whether devolution should be extended in England is in the devolution video on the Politics Explained YouTube channel. So have a look at that if you're looking for kind of some content for that. So yeah, in terms of the kind of potential essay questions and key debates, the key debates are whether the UK Constitution should be codified and entrenched. We're going to look at that near the end of the video. The impact and significance of constitutional reform since 1997, whether the UK Constitution requires further change, and if you make detailed essay plans on the questions in bold below, you should be well prepared for the exam. And these will soon be available, or at least some of them will soon be available on the Politics Explained website. So, in terms of these questions, first got to evaluate the view that the UK Constitution should be codified and entrenched, quite a simple question. Then you've got to evaluate the view that the UK Constitution is fit for purpose. That's especially looking at, okay, where is the Constitution today and how successful have those reforms since 1997 been? Then you've got to evaluate the view that the constitutional reforms since 1997 improved the British political system. And also, potentially at the end, you could also kind of answer a question on evaluate the view that the constitutional reforms introduced since 2010 have fundamentally changed the British political system or something like that. So, starting off with New Labour's constitutional reforms and an introduction to them. So, why did New Labour adopt the policy of constitutional reform? So, it became a prominent issue in UK politics in the late 20th century due to the growing popularity of the Lib Dems and Labour leader John Smith, who had preceded Tony Blair, and so he'd been really quite passionate about constitutional reform. The growth in support for nationalist movements in Scotland and Wales also created pressure for devolution. Whilst New Labour had promised not to increase income tax or massively increase public spending, therefore, introducing kind of significant constitutional reform enabled them to appear as a party of radical change and offer a vision of hope, pretty much whilst not spending much money. And ultimately, New Labour sought to present itself as a modern, democratic and new party, especially in comparison to the Conservative Party in government, which had countless sleaze scandals, and constitutional reform really modernising the country was a key way to do that. And as a result, there were four key principles of New Labour's constitutional reform programme. The first was democratisation, so it's supposed to reform undemocratic features of the UK Constitution. The second was decentralisation, so dispersing power from central government to devolved bodies and local government. The third was restoration of rights, which was supposed to bring Britain in line with the rest of Europe and better protect the rights of citizens. And then the fourth was modernisation, so reforming the House of Commons and Lords to improve the effectiveness of Parliament and modernising the whole system in general. So we're now going to go through the each reform in turn, looking at kind of, okay, what was its impact, how much success did it have, and arguments about whether it should be taken further. So the first, and in my opinion, in an essay, you really need to include this one. This is House of Lords reform. So what reforms were introduced? The New Labour sought to reform the House of Lords because the majority of peers in the House of Lords were hereditary peers who were there because they came from aristocratic families, not because they were elected or there on merit. The House of Lords was unelected and therefore seen as undemocratic. And the House of Lords had a strong Conservative majority due to its hereditary peerage. its hereditary nature, which of course not only can be seen as kind of quite anti-democratic and unfair, but also obviously didn't help Labour. So New Labour had a plan to reform the House of Lords, and it was a two-stage plan. And they adopted a two-stage plan as it was recognised that there was agreement on the key weaknesses of the Lords, but disagreement over what should replace it. So they wanted to kind of tackle the key weaknesses first, and that was in stage one, which would be removing all hereditary peers. There's a lot of agreement that should be done. Then stage two, however, would be to replace the House of Lords with a new second chamber. So they were going to take it in two stages. And in practice, stage one was carried out almost flawlessly in the 1999 House of Lords Act, and it removed the vast majority of hereditary peers, reducing them from 777 to just 92. And the 92 hereditary peers remained as a compromise with the Lords, so that the bill would pass quicker. So largely successful in passing that stage one of the reform. And from 2000, the House of Lords Appointment Commission began to nominate life peers who were experts in their fields and not necessarily linked to a party. So many of them became crossbenchers, and the Prime Minister and other party leaders continued to be able to nominate peers. So that shows how kind of these life peers largely replace those hereditary peers. Stage two, kind of replacing it with a new elected second chamber, was meant to follow this, but never did, as many Labour MPs felt the problems of hereditary peers and Conservative dominance had already been dealt with, whilst there was a lack of agreement on what the new chamber should look like. So, in terms of the arguments that the reforms were positive and significant, you've got that they undermined the hereditary basis of the House of Lords and removed its inbuilt Conservative majority. Whilst new life peers made the House of Lords more professional and significant, which has also allowed it to become more assertive and better able to effectively constrain executive power. On the other hand, the argument that these reforms were limited is that the House of Lords reform hasn't yet gone the full way, with failed attempts at stage two in 2003, 2007, and 2012 under the coalition. And the House of Lords is therefore still undemocratic, which can still be seen as quite a bit of a problem. There are still 92 hereditary peers in the House of Lords as well, and 26 bishops, all of whom, of course, no one's elected in the House of Lords, but life peers are a bit more seen as their own merit. And ex-prime ministers are still able to make appointments in the House of Lords, which is seen as problematic. And look at the videos on the Parliament topic on the Politics Explained YouTube channel for a bit more detail on the kind of problems with the appointments process. So now I'm going to look at the debate over further reform to the House of Lords. So arguments for the House of Lords being replaced with an elected second chamber is that the House of Lords is fundamentally undemocratic and the second chamber should be based on popular consent. Being elected would embolden the second chamber and result in more effective scrutiny of government legislation, as the House of Lords' current unelected nature limits its ability to scrutinise legislation, whilst many members of the House of Lords also fail to turn up regularly or play an active professional role. If a new chamber was elected through proportional representation, it likely wouldn't have a majority and would therefore be able to effectively challenge the dominance of the House of Commons and change the current system from being an elected dictatorship. If elected through proportional representation as well, a new second chamber would be much more representative of the electorate, especially in comparison to the House of Lords, which is very unrepresentative in terms of demographics, and the House of Commons, which is unrepresentative due to the first past the post voting system. So there's some arguments that it really should be further reformed to become democratic. On the other hand, some arguments that it shouldn't be replaced with an elected second chamber. And that's if the second chamber was elected, it would be able to claim democratic legitimacy and be a lot more assertive. This would risk causing significant gridlock in Parliament and prevent important legislation from being passed. And this would be especially likely if it was elected at a different time to the House of Commons, and if it was elected using proportional representation, because then it would be a lot more likely that each kind of chamber would have a majority of a different party. The current appointed nature of the House of Lords can be seen as an advantage, as life peers have a lot of expertise in different areas and can therefore provide effective scrutiny. And current problems with appointments by ex-prime ministers could also be fixed without resorting to an elected second chamber. And it can be argued that the current balance of the chambers can be seen as working, with the House of Lords being a less powerful revising or amending chamber that is able to hold the government to account on key issues using its delaying power when it needs to. And finally, it can be argued that an elected second chamber would be a lot more likely to be concerned with party politics than anything else. So it wouldn't be defined by regions or kind of seek to represent local constituencies. As with the House of Commons, it will be defined by party politics. And that can be seen in Australia and America, which have similar systems. Finally, going to look at Keir Starmer's proposed reforms to the House of Lords. So Keir Starmer recently came out in December 22 and announced plans to abolish the House of Lords and replace it with a new democratically elected second chamber. Though full plans will be outlined in Labour's next manifesto, they'll include removing politicians' power to make appointments to the Lords and replacing it with an elected chamber that represents the UK's nations and regions to safeguard devolution. The reforms would seek to ensure that the chamber would remain a second chamber that amended and scrutinised legislation rather than replacing the key functions of the House of Commons. And kind of linked to this is the fact that he's criticised recent Tory governments for undermining trust in politics by handing peerages to what he called lackeys and donors, such as Boris Johnson's friend and Evening Standard owner, Evgeny Lebedev, and billionaire Conservative Party donor, David Hartman. So that's everything in terms of the House of Lords. Could be a whole essay in itself, or could be just one paragraph in an essay, but in my opinion, definitely a really important part to learn well. The next key reform introduced by New Labour was the Human Rights Act. So, as I kind of say here, for a little bit more detail on this, look at the Rights in Context video on the Politics Explained YouTube channel, and the accompanying Everything You Need to Know PDF guide on the Politics Explained website. Because there's a little bit more detail on rights, because that's kind of specifically focused on rights, but still going to cover it in significant detail here. So, what reforms were introduced? So, the Human Rights Act 1998 enshrined the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law, in effect from 2000, meaning that rights could be defended in UK courts rather than having to go to Strasbourg. So, effectively, copy and pasted it, but meant that those rights can now be defended in the UK Supreme Court, UK High Court, different courts as well. And the rights protected by the Act included the right to life, right to a fair trial, right to privacy and family life, and the prohibition of torture, among many others. In terms of arguments that these reforms were positive and significant, it's that since the Human Rights Act, it's claimed that the UK has developed a rights-based culture, as all legislation must be compliant with the Act, or is supposed to be, or is kind of advised to be compliant with the Act. And judges can declare early acts of Parliament incompatible with it, though they can't legally compel Parliament to make changes due to the concept of parliamentary sovereignty. However, Parliament usually does act to address any issues raised by the courts, and has a joint committee on human rights to scrutinise bills and ensure they're compatible with the Human Rights Act, therefore demonstrating the persuasive influence of the HRA. For example, in A versus Secretary of State for the Home Department, part of the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act of 2001, this part of it was declared incompatible with Articles 5 and 14 of the Human Rights Act by permitting the detention of suspected international terrorists in a way that discriminated on the grounds of nationality or immigration status. As a consequence, the Prevention of Terrorism Act 2005 was amended. The Human Rights Act can therefore be seen as limiting parliamentary sovereignty and furthering the rule of law in the UK. On the other hand, the Human Rights Act has been criticised for giving unelected judges too much power, and it's also been criticised for being too weak. So it may be used to check other laws, but it's not entrenched and could still be repealed by a simple act of Parliament, whilst also not being legally binding on Parliament. So judges can offer declarations of incompatibility, but that doesn't mean they'll be listened to. Parliament can just ignore them. The Illegal Migration Bill, for example, was introduced by Home Secretary Suella Braverman on the 7th of March 2023, with a Section 19 note stating that there was a likelihood the provisions of the bill would be incompatible with the Human Rights Act, and the government were aware of that, but that the government wanted to proceed with it nonetheless. So that shows kind of, okay, maybe actually the persuasive influence of the Human Rights Act isn't kind of that big. Maybe it's become quite limited. Many critics on the right also say that the Human Rights Act stops terror suspects from being deported, and that the Human Rights Act therefore favours undeserving individuals rather than protecting the legitimate freedoms of UK citizens and protecting society as a whole. For a bit more on that, go to the Rights in Context video on the Politics Explained YouTube channel. So, in terms of potential further reforms, the first one is a British Bill of Rights. So at various points, the Conservative Party has backed pulling out of the European Convention on Human Rights and replacing the Human Rights Act with a British Bill of Rights, which has been criticised by hundreds of human rights groups for seeking to remove rights in the UK. The proposed Bill of Rights will make it easier to deport foreign criminals by elevating public safety over the right to a family life, and it would also increase freedom of the press by elevating the right to freedom of expression over the right to privacy. Justice Secretary, or now former Justice Secretary actually, because he was recently sacked for breaking individual ministerial responsibility, Dominic Raab argues that the Human Rights Act has led to lots of unjustifiably successful human rights claims in courts, especially in relation to the deportation of foreign criminals and immigrants. So that's one of the potential reforms, is the British Bill of Rights, which in reality would actually remove rights in the UK. The British Bill of Rights would also make the UK Supreme Court the final court of appeal, rather than the European Court of Human Rights, as a lot of Conservatives are opposed to the ECHR. And it would also weaken the protection of rights in the UK, as the British Bill of Rights would be a simple act of Parliament, whilst the European Convention on Human Rights is an international treaty. So yeah, that's everything in terms of the human rights. As I said, go to that rights and context video for a bit more detail if you want a bit more detail on that. The next thing is electoral reform. With this one as well, go to the electoral systems video on the channel for a bit more detail, but we're going to go kind of look at it now in a bit less detail, but from the kind of view of electoral reform and constitutional reform. So what reforms were introduced? The introduction of devolved assemblies also led to the introduction of various proportional representation systems in Scotland, Wales, London and Northern Ireland. The additional member system was introduced for the Welsh Assembly and Scottish Parliament. The single transferable vote system was introduced for the Northern Irish Assembly, and the supplementary vote system, though it's now been removed and replaced with first past the post, was introduced for London mayoral elections. In 1999, New Labour also introduced a version of the party list system with multi-member constituencies for elections to the European Parliament. But obviously, now that we've left the EU, that's no longer takes place in the UK. So, in what ways were these reforms positive and significant? Where these more proportional systems were introduced, they resulted in more proportional electoral results and fairer representation of smaller parties in particular. And New Labour's electoral reform therefore improved democracy in the UK. The electoral reform can be seen as a recognition that first past the post is a flawed system. On the other hand, in what ways were these reforms limited is that though Blair had briefly considered it before the 1997 election, the first past the post electoral system for UK Parliament elections wasn't changed. Democracy therefore continues to be limited for the most important UK election. This was in large part because Labour had great success on the first past the post in 1997, 2001 and 2005, and they were resistant to changing a system that had granted them significant majorities. In terms of potential further reforms, again, look at the electoral systems video for more detail on this, but the arguments for a more proportional system being introduced for UK Parliament elections is that more proportional systems have been shown to be effective in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, especially in Scotland and Wales, where minority and coalition governments have been very stable. A more proportional electoral system would improve democracy in the UK by improving voter choice and being far more proportional and representative, particularly by improving the representation of minor parties and limiting the dominance of the two main parties. On the other hand, arguments against a proportional system being introduced for UK Parliament elections are that a more proportional electoral system was rejected in a 2011 referendum, in the AV referendum. The MP constituency link is strong under first past the post, and first past the post also produces strong majority governments, excludes extremist parties, and is easy to use and delivers quick results. So effectively for each of these bullet points, I've got a whole paragraph in the electoral systems video, so look at that one. But obviously in these essays actually it's likely to only be a paragraph, so you need to kind of work out how to, like the whole topic is likely to only be a paragraph, so you need to work out how to kind of really shorten it down as well and pick out the key points. Finally, how likely is further electoral reform? So further electoral reform, particularly replacing the first past the post electoral system, is very unlikely. The Conservative Party strongly supports first past the post, whilst the Labour Party supports first past the post also, and would be very unlikely to replace it if it got them into government for the first time in 14 years, as it potentially looks quite likely to do so. So that's everything in terms of electoral reform. What I'm going to go on to now is devolution. Again, with this, there's a whole video on devolution on the Politics Explained YouTube channel. So we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail, a bit less detail, but from the kind of view of constitutional reform. So, what reforms were introduced? Following referendums in 1997 to 98, devolved bodies were introduced in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and the Greater London Authority was also introduced in 1999. So Scotland was given the most powers out of all the devolved bodies due to Scotland's strong nationalist movement, including control over most public services. With the powers reserved for Westminster being listed, including defence, macroeconomic policy, foreign policy, constitutional matters, etc. With the rest being reserved for Scotland. Scotland has since gained even more powers, including significant fiscal and constitutional powers. With Wales started with far fewer powers than Scotland and Northern Ireland, as there was very little nationalist sentiment in Wales, and the 1997 referendum on Welsh devolution was very close, with a majority of just 50.5% on a 50% turnout. At first, therefore, Wales only had the Welsh Assembly that had no legislative powers or First Minister and was kind of only granted administrative devolution. But over the years, Wales has gained more powers in response to growing nationalism and public support for devolution, and it now has key primary legislative powers and can be seen as having service devolution as Scotland was originally granted. In terms of Northern Ireland, devolution was originally introduced in 1998 as part of a broader peace agreement between Catholics and Protestants, nationalists and unionists, following the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Power sharing is key to the Northern Ireland Assembly. The executive must be led by a First Minister and Deputy First Minister, and several key decisions, including the budget and programme for government, require cross-community support between nationalists and unionists. In 1998, Northern Ireland was, like Scotland, given primary legislative control over areas not reserved for Westminster, and it kind of was given similar powers to Scotland at first. And apart from corporation tax and policing and justice being devolved, the Northern Irish Assembly has gained few powers since and still lacks major tax raising powers. In terms of the Greater London Authority, it was introduced and controlled by a directly elected mayor and elected London Assembly. So the mayor was first Ken Livingstone. Well, I'm missing someone in the middle, but then I think Boris Johnson, and has since been Sadiq Khan. And the Greater London Authority has strategic responsibility over and power over policing, transport, and economic development. In terms of arguments that these reforms were positive and significant, it's that devolution improved democracy in the UK by creating governments closer to the people. Devolution reduced the sovereignty of the UK Parliament by giving significant power to other legislative bodies. And devolution to Northern Ireland helped restore peace following the Troubles, whilst devolution could be seen as helping to keep the UK together. In terms of arguments that these reforms are limited, it's that at first Wales was given limited legislative powers. Devolution has also arguably increased tensions between different parts of the UK and failed to stop a growing independence movement in Scotland, with Scotland nearly going independent in 2014, and now it looks like it does have pretty much a majority support for independence within the country. Devolution was also asymmetric, with there being no English Parliament or substantial representation of England, therefore creating a democratic deficit. As I said, for a lot more detail on that, look at the devolution video on the YouTube channel. In terms of potential further reforms, for Scotland, there are a few further powers that can be devolved to the Scottish Parliament, as it already holds a great amount of power. There are some, though, and Devo Max could be introduced to prevent growing calls for independence. Many polls suggest that if there was an Indie Ref 2 now, then the Scottish public would vote for independence. The more powers that are devolved to Scotland, though, the more pertinent the West Lothian question becomes. Again, look at the devolution video for a bit more detail on that. In terms of Wales, Welsh independence is growing in popularity, with some polls over 30% support, and this may lead to even more devolution to Wales, with calls for Wales to have the same powers that Scotland now has. This may have also been influenced by the COVID period, in which Wales demonstrated it could diverge from England on issues, often successfully. In terms of Northern Ireland, further devolution is unlikely, as unionists are very opposed, but a referendum on reunification with the Republic of Ireland is possible, especially as it's estimated that Catholics now outnumber Protestants in Northern Ireland. And finally, the key point for kind of further devolution is for England, and in the devolution video this goes into a lot more detail in relation to this, but further devolution could be introduced in England to change the asymmetric nature of devolution, solve the West Lothian question, and increase the representation of England and give an outlet to English nationalism. There are two key possible reforms which I look at in that video. An English Parliament could be introduced, or more regional devolution. For example, city regions and regional assemblies could be introduced in England. So yeah, that's everything in terms of devolution for this video. What I'm going to look at now is the Supreme Court. And again, with this one, I keep going on about it, but there's a whole video on the Politics Explained YouTube channel on the Supreme Court. So look at that for a lot more detail. So what reforms were introduced? So Blair's government introduced the Supreme Court with the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005. The creation of the court was designed to end the fusion of powers at the highest level of the UK judiciary and modernise by moving towards a separation of powers that would increase the highest court's judicial independence and make it clearly separate from Parliament. Previously, the most senior judges have sat as members of the House of Lords and were known as the Law Lords, and the Constitutional Reform effectively picked them up, put them in a different location, so really took them out of Parliament, and obviously most of those have retired now, so it's new members as well. The Constitutional Reform Act also reduced the powers of the Lord Chancellor. So prior to the Constitutional Reform Act, the Lord Chancellor had three roles. One was the executive role, one was a legislative role, and one was a judicial role, with a key kind of two key powers being that they were a cabinet minister and they elected the key members of like the highest judges in the country, which can be seen as really not very good for the separation of powers and not very good for democracy. So it's really criticised for lacking independence, and as a result, the Constitutional Reform Act removed the legislative and judicial roles of the Lord Chancellor, who is now just a government minister. So, in terms of arguments or ways in which these reforms are positive and significant, is that the introduction of the Supreme Court brought the UK in line with most of Europe, by clearly separating the legislative and the judicial branches. This increased the independence of the country's highest court and made it more effective in holding the government and parliament to account. It can therefore be seen as improving the rule of law. The downgrading of the role of the Lord Chancellor also increased judicial independence and neutrality. On the other hand, ways in which these reforms are limited is that the Supreme Court still lacks the power to strike down laws passed by Parliament, whilst the Supreme Court could, in theory, and legally, could be abolished with a simple act of Parliament, so what could simply be abolished by Parliament, and parliamentary sovereignty is therefore still intact. In terms of potential further reforms, is that though the Supreme Court has become increasingly kind of politicised of late, especially in relation to key Brexit cases, so not necessarily it's politicised as in it's not politically neutral anymore, but it's taken on a much more kind of prominent role in UK politics and become a lot more kind of in the media. So even though that's happened, it seems unlikely there will be any reforms to the court in the near future. If a codified and entrenched constitution were introduced in the future, then the Supreme Court could gain the power to strike down laws passed by Parliament. So that's the Supreme Court. Final thing I'm going to look at is some other minor constitutional changes introduced by New Labour. Just so you know about them, potentially if they come from the source question or something like that. The first is the Freedom of Information Act, which was introduced to make it easier for opposition MPs, journalists, voters and others to request information from the government. Members of the public also gain the right to access any information held about them by public bodies. As a consequence, it can be seen as improving the rights of citizens. The Freedom of Information Act has been praised for making the government more transparent and enabling journalists to seek out sensitive information and hold the government to account. So the MP's expenses scandal, for example, was discovered through Freedom of Information requests by journalists. On the other hand, the Freedom of Information Act can be seen as too weak, as the government can turn down some requests if they judge that they would negatively affect the workings of the current government. Further, it has been criticised for making it more difficult for politicians to discuss controversial matters through formal channels, which leads to them being discussed informally, especially over WhatsApp at the moment, or not at all. And Tony Blair has since said he regrets passing the Freedom of Information Act for this reason. And then finally, New Labour also made some minor reforms to the House of Commons. Though there was little attempt to reform the House of Commons and strengthen its ability to hold the government to account, New Labour did introduce some minor changes to the House of Commons. So efforts were made to make the House of Commons more family-friendly, including by greatly reducing the number of late-night sittings. And since 2002, New Labour also mandated the Prime Minister to be questioned by the House of Commons Liaison Select Committee twice a year. Okay, so that was everything in terms of New Labour's constitutional reforms. What I'm going to go on to now is constitutional reforms since 2010. So New Labour's constitutional reforms were pretty significant. The one since 2010, probably barring Brexit in my opinion, can be seen as not as significant. So starting off with an introduction to the coalition's constitutional reforms. So the Conservative Party had traditionally opposed reform to the Constitution, as they prefer to let change happen gradually and in response to circumstances, rather than through design. They support the uncodified Constitution, which has allowed change to happen naturally, and fear that any major changes to the Constitution will disrupt the functioning of the political system. So that was the first part of the coalition, right? The major part of the coalition. They were kind of together, though, with the Lib Dems, who really, for decades, their key policy had been constitutional reform. So radical constitutional reform had always been one of the key policies of the Liberal Democrats, and they supported improving the functioning and democracy of the political system by changing the voting system to make it more proportional, removing undemocratic elements like the House of Lords, and constraining the power of the executive. The implementation of proposals for constitutional reform were one of the key conditions for the Liberal Democrats joining the coalition with the Conservatives. And after the 2010 expenses scandal, there was a heightened anti-politics mood in the country. And as a consequence, Clegg, as a kind of outsider, tried to package his reforms as a great modernisation of the political system. And he argued that incremental change will not do. It's time for a wholesale, big bang approach to constitutional reform. So what I'm going to look at first is an overview of the constitutional reform under the coalition. So which constitutional reforms were passed? The first was the Fixed Term Parliament Act. The second was that the coalition implemented the recommendations of the Right Committee, which gave more power to backbenchers. For a bit more detail on that, look at the Parliament videos on the Politics Explained YouTube channel. The Conservative-backed 2011 EU Act enshrined into law the principle that any new treaties transferring power to the EU should be subject to a referendum. Obviously, that was never used and now is kind of completely irrelevant because we've left the EU. The coalition introduced legislation altering the line of succession to the crown so that gender no longer played any role. And in 2012, 10 cities held referendums on whether to have a mayor, whilst the coalition also accepted devolution and independence referendums in Wales and Scotland, respectively. So those are the constitutional reforms that were passed. Not many of them, to be honest, that significant. There were a lot of constitutional reforms that were blocked or abandoned by the coalition. One of the Lib Dems' key conditions for joining the coalition was the holding of the alternative vote referendum in 2011. Cameron managed to get legislation for it passed, but the Conservatives led a successful campaign against AV, which was a more proportional system, and it was conclusively rejected by the electorate. This ended the honeymoon period between the two parties and effectively ended the prospects of further electoral reform for a decade or so, or for at least a decade or so. The coalition introduced a bill to replace the House of Lords with an 80% elected Senate, so doing that kind of stage 2 reform we talked about earlier, with 300 to 400 members and 15-year terms. But this was blocked in 2012 when Tory rebels sided with Labour. The Conservatives had also sought to introduce legislation reducing the number of MPs from 650 to 600 and equalising the size of constituencies. But the Lib Dems withdrew their support, in large part because the boundary changes would have benefited the Tories and harmed the Lib Dems. Finally, the coalition set up commissions on reforming the HRA and dealing with the West Lothian question, but neither process resulted in change as the two parties disagreed. So, starting off with the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, I'm going to look at a couple of them in a bit more detail, ones that were passed. So the Fixed Term Parliament Act removed the prerogative power of the Prime Minister to call a snap election when it suited them, by requiring 2/3 of Parliament to support a snap election before it was called. It was designed to reassure the Lib Dems that Cameron wouldn't call a snap election when it suited the Conservative Party, and therefore distract him from governing effectively. It performed its role during the coalition government, which lasted the whole 5 years. After the coalition, however, the legislation was largely ineffective, as shown in the 2017 and 2019 elections, when the government were able to shame the opposition into voting for an election, which meant that they were unlikely to block, as it would make them seem very weak, and kind of give up an opportunity to win power. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act has now been repealed. It was repealed by Boris Johnson's government in 2022. And then the other key reform that was introduced was further devolution to Wales. So following a 2011 referendum in which 64% voted in favour, Wales gained primary legislative control over devolved areas, similar to what Scotland was originally given. This therefore brought Wales in line with the Welsh, with the Scottish and Northern Irish devolved bodies. Following the referendum, the coalition government set up the Silk Commission to consider even further devolution to Wales, leading to the 2014 Government of Wales Act, which renamed the Welsh Executive the Welsh Government and also gave it control over landfill tax and stamp duty, alongside the substantial control it already had over health, education, transport, etc. So, during the coalition, the Welsh Assembly, the Welsh Parliament gained a lot more power compared to what it had before. So that's it in terms of reforms under the coalition. What I'm going to look at now is reforms undertaken since 2015. The first one of these is further devolution to Scotland. So in the run-up to and since the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, Scotland has gained more powers in order to try and satisfy calls for more autonomy and disincentivise independence. This was in particular in the Scotland Act of 2016, which gave the Scottish Parliament further powers, particularly in the area of tax rates, and so fiscal devolution. Scotland gained control over 50% of VAT, the power to set all bands and rates of income tax, which was actually used recently to raise the top and high rates of income tax, key welfare benefits, and control over the franchise, which they used to reduce the voting age to 16. This can be seen as fiscal devolution and brought Scotland closer to Devo Max, whilst further reducing the sovereignty of the UK Parliament and increasing the strength of the West Lothian question. The next thing introduced since 2015 was Brexit, and this is, in my opinion, the most significant constitutional change for decades. Perhaps, perhaps the most significant constitutional change is Brexit. Following the EU referendum in 2016, Britain finally left the European Union, leading to Parliament gaining substantial sovereignty it ceded to the EU. Got a whole video on kind of the EU and Britain leaving the EU on the Politics Explained YouTube channel, so look into that for a bit more detail. And the final three are English votes for English laws, the Recall of MPs Act, and recently Rishi Sunak's use of a Section 35 law. So in terms of English votes for English laws, power being devolved to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland raised the West Lothian question, which questioned why Scottish, or kind of Welsh as well, and Northern Irish as well, MPs should be able to vote on English matters in the UK Parliament that don't affect their constituents, such as healthcare in England, well, when English MPs can't do the same in the Scottish Parliament. And in order to seek to tackle this, EVEL was introduced by the Conservative government in 2015. This allowed English MPs to veto any legislation affecting only England from being passed. It didn't, however, allow English MPs to make their own laws. It wasn't used often, so it was used for around a third of bills in the 2015 to 2017 Parliament, but it may have become more significant if a government was elected with a majority in the UK, but not in England. And it was criticised for creating two tiers of MPs, adding unnecessary complications and not providing a viable expression for English identity, and was scrapped by Boris Johnson's government in July 2020. The final thing introduced by Cameron's government was the Recall of MPs Act of 2015, which was introduced in response to the fact that voters had no legal means between elections of removing scandalous MPs who refused to resign their seats. It meant that if an MP is sentenced to a custodial sentence or is suspended from the Commons for more than 21 days, a by-election is triggered, if at least 10% of constituents sign a recall petition. In October 2019, for example, there was a Brecon and Radnorshire by-election after Christopher Davies provided misleading expenses claims, and he was replaced in that election with a Lib Dem. This is an example of direct democracy, which increases the sovereignty of the people. And then finally, this is very recently, is Rishi Sunak's use of a Section 35 order. So in 2023, Rishi Sunak used a Section 35 order, so Section 35 of the Scotland Act, to block Scotland's proposed gender reform bill, which would have introduced self-identification for those who wanted to change gender and allow 16 and 17-year-olds to do so. Section 35 of the Scotland Act allows the UK government to block a bill from a devolved body in exceptional circumstances if it believes it will have an adverse impact on UK-wide law. So this Section 35 was always there. It's just kind of a significant constitutional change. It's not a major constitutional change, but it's kind of quite significant constitutionally because Sunak used it for the first time. It had never been used before. And it can be seen as somewhat reaffirming the sovereignty of the UK Parliament. So yeah, that's everything in terms of constitutional reform since 2010. What I'm going to look at now is the codification and entrenchment of the Constitution and the key debate over it. Okay, so finally looking at the debate over the codification of the Constitution, and starting off with what does decodification and what do entrenchment mean. The UK Constitution is uncodified and entrenched, meaning that it isn't written down in a single document and can be changed with a simple act of Parliament rather than being protected to a greater extent. Look at the first video on the nature and sources of the UK Constitution for a bit more detail on that. As a result, one of the key debates in relation to constitutional change is whether the UK Constitution should be codified in a single document and entrenched so that it couldn't be easily changed, including a Bill of Rights. Firstly, looking at developments in relation to codification, firstly, how the coalition was prepared for can be used as evidence for advocates and opponents of codification. So in preparation for the coalition, civil servants put together a cabinet manual detailing the procedures for a coalition, and it was agreed that Gordon Brown should be caretaker until a government was formed. Collective ministerial responsibility among cabinet members was also adapted, as was government decision-making. Preparations for a possible hung parliament and the drafting of the cabinet manual can be seen as a step towards a codified constitution because it was written down. On the other hand, it can be seen as an argument for an uncodified constitution, as it was the ability of the uncodified constitution to cope with a coalition and a hung parliament can be used as evidence of its robustness and flexibility. So what I'm going to look at now is arguments for the codification of the Constitution. And the first one is that Parliament and the Supreme Court would be better able to check the executive. Codification could enable Parliament to better check and constrain the government, making the government more responsive and accountable to the people's representatives. It would therefore provide a clearer separation of powers. For example, the House of Lords could become elected and therefore be given greater powers, or Parliament could have a veto on certain key decisions, such as the appointment of ministers. This would not only constrain the executive, but also reform an undemocratic, outdated aspect of the Constitution. The Supreme Court could also strike down laws if they infringe upon the Constitution. This said, such changes, potentially not the last one, could be made without codification. So the kind of power of Parliament to scrutinise the executive could be kind of increased anyway. The next argument is that codification would encourage public engagement in politics. So codified constitutions help citizens hold the government to account by spelling out clearly what roles and powers each branch has and what rights and duties citizens have. Voters are therefore able to judge how well different institutions or individual politicians have performed. And it would help to engage more citizens in the political process and encourage political participation. It could also be argued that a British Bill of Rights would give citizens a greater understanding of of their rights and attachment to their rights as citizens. And finally, a codified constitution would bring Britain into line with other Western democracies. The next argument is that the current constitution is too easy to amend. So the British constitution is arguably too easy to amend, as any statute law can be replaced by Parliament, whatever its constitutional implications. So that's just with a simple majority of 50 plus 1 in Parliament. For example, the Fixed Term Parliament Act was arguably passed for short-term political reasons in relation to the coalition, but could have had far-reaching implications, preventing a government with no majority from triggering an election. Entrenchment would protect the constitution from political interference from an overarching executive and make it more likely that potential reforms are fully debated before being enacted. And finally, codification, not finally, but the next one is that codification could also be seen as codification could also effectively protect rights, especially with the British Bill of Rights. So codified constitution protect key rights as they're entrenched and can only be changed or curtailed with widespread popular and political support. This prevents hasty and heavy-handed actions that might be seen as desirable in a crisis, but would in practice undermine essential rights and freedoms. Such an argument could be made about COVID-19 lockdowns or Blair's counter-terrorism measures. It would also prevent a government overturning the Human Rights Act and removing rights, as the Conservative Party has often threatened to do so. And finally, its argument is the neutrality of the judiciary. This is mostly a counterpoint to one of the arguments against that I'm going to go through in a minute, and that's that judges are neutral and arguably best placed to interpret the constitution and make sure that it is applied fairly by public bodies, including Parliament. And finally, some recent events can be used as arguments for a codified constitution, and that's that it arguably shouldn't have been so easy to change a fundamental part of the constitution, EU membership, on the basis of an advisory referendum whose support commanded the support of less than 50% of the franchise. Secondly, the constitutional requirements were so unclear that the government had to be taken to the Supreme Court to prevent it from unilaterally triggering Article 50. So it can be argued that a codified constitution would make the constitution a lot clearer, and the rights and kind of roles of different bodies a lot clearer. The division of powers is also very unclear in Britain. Whilst Brexit has shown power to be very centralised, with devolved bodies having little say in Brexit, despite having a serious impact on their future, and a codified constitution could change that. Fundamental constitutional provisions could be protected by requiring supermajorities in Parliament rather than through judicial review. And it is uncertain if the government can authorise armed combat without Parliament's approval, because it was a convention, and it's with Theresa May, it's not clear whether that still applies. So there's a lot of conventions in the UK system where it's very unclear who has power, who has particular power, and that can be argued to be a drawback. So now going into arguments against the codification of the constitution. The first one of these is the UK's uncodified constitution makes it very flexible, which can be seen as an advantage. The flexibility of Britain's uncodified constitution has allowed the British system to evolve gradually and adapt to unusual circumstances when necessary. The constitution has evolved a great deal over the past 2 centuries, making Britain a more democratic system, and New Labour's programme just demonstrates that major changes can be made, for example, with devolution, with the House of Lords. Further, many of the reformed advocates of a codified constitutional support, such as an elected House of Lords or a British Bill of Rights, could be introduced without codification. Secondly, the UK's uncodified constitution is able to deal with emergencies. The uncodified nature of the constitution has allowed governments to deal with emergencies, such as suspending elections during the wars, and dealing with changed circumstances, such as security measures post 9/11, therefore allowing the system to develop in a way that suits Britain and can be better kept up to date. The emergency measures brought in to respond to the COVID crisis, which significantly impinged on human rights but were seen by many as justified, are a good example of this. And another example is to prepare for the 2010 coalition government, the Cabinet Manual adapted conventions such as collective responsibility and Fixed Term Parliament Act were introduced that showed that it can be really adaptable as well. The next argument is that the UK's uncodified constitution produces strong governments that can effectively pass laws. So Britain's constitution typically provides for strong governments that can carry out their legislative programmes without facing the same level of checks and balances as in many codified constitutions, such as in the US. British voters can be confident that governments elected with a good majority can implement their manifesto pledges, unlike in countries such as the US, where it's very difficult to pass legislation in important areas such as climate change. Further, one could argue that weaker governments with smaller majorities and lower levels of public support face greater checks and balances. The next argument is that conventions are an effective part of the UK's uncodified constitution. Though they're not entrenched, the conventions and tradition established by the UK constitution are widely revered and therefore hard to ignore or change. When changes do happen, such as the creation of select committees, they tend to have broad support. And further, conventions are arguably stronger than supporters of an uncodified constitution. Supporters of an uncodified constitution, as we went through, argue that it's far too easy to change, and conventions make the constitution very unclear. But it can be argued they're actually a lot stronger than that. And that can be seen in the 2020 prorogation of Parliament case, where the Supreme Court upheld the convention that prorogation shouldn't be used by the government for political purposes. Capturing all of these conventions and traditions in a written document may be difficult, and some aspects of the constitutional framework could therefore be lost if the UK constitution was codified. And a few more arguments. First is that the codification would increase the power of judges. So a codified constitution would increase the power of unelected, unaccountable, and unrepresentative judges to police the constitution and make it difficult and make difficult decisions about how it should be applied, which would drag them into political matters and grant them too much political power. It can be seen as better that Parliament resolves such issues, as it's accountable to the people. Secondly, in relation to rights and whether there should be a British Bill of Rights with the codification of the Constitution, it can be argued that the Human Rights Act functions effectively. So it maintains parliamentary sovereignty, but is very effective. It has strong persuasive influence in ensuring that bills comply with it, and the Parliament is likely to act on any finding of incompatibility. Therefore, it's argued that the Human Rights Act has in fact provided a robust framework for the protection of British citizens, the rights of British citizens, and therefore a British Bill of Rights isn't necessary. And finally, it just argued that the codification would be a complex process where A, there's not much public support for it, but B, it would be very difficult to agree on a codified constitution, and therefore can be seen as having more drawbacks than actually committing to the process. And then finally, how recent events could be used in arguments against a codified constitution, just to give you some ideas. It's that Brexit arguably showed how power is dispersed in Britain, with the Supreme Court, government and Parliament all being involved in the triggering of Article 50. The division of powers in the UK is normally very clear, and the Article 50 decision strengthened this division of powers. Secondly, clarifying answers to questions or uncertainties on issues such as referendums doesn't require the codification of the Constitution, just legislation. There is also a delicate balance in the Constitution between law and politics, and codifying the Constitution would upset that balance in favour of the unelected judges, which isn't in democratic interest. Brexit is also mainly a question for Westminster and not the devolved bodies, not because the UK is overly centralised, but because the UK's international relations are reserved to Westminster. So that kind of argument that Brexit shows how the UK is too centralised, there's a good counter for that. And finally, codified constitutions freeze the balance of power, of political power, according to the prejudices of a particular moment, as can be seen in the US, whereas the unwritten British Constitution continues to adapt to the changing needs of the nation. So yeah, that was a pretty long video going through a lot of stuff, right? Changes, new Labour's reforms, changes since 2010, and now looking at the codification of the Constitution. But now going to some essay questions. So evaluate the view that the UK Constitution should be codified and entrenched. This one would effectively match up some of these arguments. So you could do a paragraph on rights protection. So should there be a British Bill of Rights with the codification of the Constitution, how it could protect rights better, including by giving judges more power, versus the counter-arguments that it would give judges too much power and the Human Rights Act protects rights effectively. You could then potentially do a paragraph on how the flexibility of the UK's current constitution is an argument against codification versus the fact that it can be argued to be too easy to amend and governments can therefore exploit it. And then potentially a final paragraph you could do on something like, on the one hand, how the uncodified constitution enables governments to deal with emergencies and produce strong governments that can effectively pass laws. And then you could counter that with potentially that actually the current constitution is too easy to amend and not well protected. Something like that. So I'm going to have kind of an essay plan on this in the UK government essay plans on the Politics Explained website, but there's a lot of different ways you could do it and just kind of match up some of the arguments. In terms of evaluate the view that the UK constitution is fit for purpose, you could pick 3 different ways in which it can be argued kind of for and against. So you could look at House of Lords reform, for and against. You could potentially look at the Human Rights Act, for and against. And then finally, you could maybe look at devolution, for and against, whether there should be further devolution, or you could actually, potentially better, could actually have a paragraph on codification in that. Thirdly, evaluate the view that constitutional reforms introduced since 1997 improve the British political system. Again, just pick some reforms. You could do, especially House of Lords, I'd probably recommend. You could do devolution, and you could do the Human Rights Act. You could do different ones. You could do the Supreme Court as well. Lots of different flexibility with that. And then evaluate the view that constitutional reforms introduced since 2010 has had a significant impact on the UK Constitution. For that, you could potentially do Brexit as a paragraph. You could do the Recall of MPs Act as a paragraph, and then maybe you could do further devolution to Wales and Scotland as a paragraph. But as I said, none of these, like, you have to do it this way. It's just giving you some ideas of how you could potentially structure it. So yeah, that's everything in terms of this video. As I said at the start of the video, the PDF you can see up there, you can find on the Politics Explained website with the first link in the description, where you can also find lots of other resources to help you in your politics A-level, including essay plans on a lot of these questions, as well as a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in. So yeah, let me know in the comment section below if you've got any comments or questions that I could help with, and I'll see you in the next video.